Hey everyone, and welcome to the Contemplative Science Podcast. My name is Jamie, and as always, I'm here with co-host Dr. Mark Miller. Mark, how are you, mate?
Hey, James, I'm good, man. We got some good news, didn't we? We've doubled our listener base. How cool is that? Not bad. We must be getting the right people on, and I think today is another example of getting the right person on. So I'm excited.
Yeah, absolutely, because today is Dr. Elli Weisbaum. Elli is a Toronto-based mindfulness practitioner and teacher. She attended her first retreat, this I thought was interesting, with scholar, Zen master, and Nobel Peace Prize winner Thich Nhat Hanh at the age of 10, and has since worked internationally. She's currently, amongst other things, based at the University of Toronto as an assistant professor in the Buddhism, Mental Health, and Psychology program. Elli, how are you?
I am, well, in the space of mental health, we always say, hi, how are we? How are you? And we say, oh, great. But, I think a more appropriate answer usually is just, I'm many. If I'm being totally honest on any given day, I am many, but I'm delighted to be here.
I'm glad delight is one of the many. Um,
That's right. Delight is one of the many. It's a big one, but it's just
Four
one of the
noble,
many.
four noble truths if we're getting into Buddhism today, right? There is suffering and there is happiness. I want to be honest with you up front.
Yeah, I love
um,
that.
so let's, on that very note, jump in. So I'm interested, basically, in the relationship between mental health and Buddhism. Um, to the degree there are benefits, and we're going to get into them, are they incidental, or are they by design and they're in the fabric of Buddhism because they bring mental health benefits?
Yeah, such an interesting question. And I look forward to kind of unpacking, the integration of, what do we consider evidence to be in terms of contemporary science? What are we drawing upon in terms of evidence, in terms of the, long-term history of the N of one that has been the experiment, perhaps, of Buddhism? But more broadly, what you made me think about is really, I think when folks approach me when we talk about drawing upon Buddhism towards maybe mindfulness-based interventions or practices that we have that we're bringing into healthcare spaces, educational spaces, business spaces. We can expand beyond that. But what your question made me think of is why this body of knowledge? If we're interested in mental health, why are we interested in the body of knowledge that we might call Buddhist psychology, Buddhist philosophy, these streams that we can talk about? And for me, I work a lot with like physicians and in healthcare settings. And I say, like, if you're interested in best practices for a certain type of surgery, like you want to go find the experts who've been doing that surgery for a while, get their opinions, find out what they know. And so for me, it's a very similar thing. If we're interested in mental health, in well-being, in transforming our suffering and what it means to be human, let's go find the experts who've been looking into this for a while and find out what they think the best practices are. And so for me, that's a lot of my work, what I do, and why I'm particularly interested in the body of knowledge that we call, Buddhist thought, the Dharma, this collection of teachings, because this is the area they've been interested in for quite a while. And so there's a lot to explore there.
So, with that said, to what degree do you think it's incidental, or to what degree do you think it is by design?
Yeah, and maybe I can come back to as a qualitative researcher, like, how are we using these words? When you say incidental, can you kind of clarify for me or define for me what you mean by that?
Yes, so I mean, Buddhism develops, and does it develop, and there's like lots of reasons why it does develops the way it does, cultural and otherwise. And oh my god, lo and behold, there are all these mental health benefits. Or was the development very much shaped by the benefits of mental health?
Yeah, and so I guess bringing kind of the lenses that I bring to this, which should be my kind of academic training, looking through the neuroscience and research, and then my training with Thich Nhat Hanh, with Plum Village, which is engaged Buddhism, engaged mindfulness. So how do we maybe take it off the cushion and integrate it in our lives? We call Thich Nhat Hanh Thai for short, which means teacher. It's a little less of a mouthful, but also because we value him as a teacher. But Thai was really interested in going back to the roots of these teachings. What was the Buddha saying? Before there was a Buddhism, there's like a human walking around teaching things. And I would say at the heart of that is this interest. We might say the Buddha was a researcher at heart. This interest in like systematically looking at how we can develop qualities within ourselves that can benefit our mental health and that of the communities we're part of. And so for me, I would say it really is by design. If you look at the original sutras, and my students and I like unpack these in like fourth year like research methodology courses and looking at Buddhist psychology, again, there's like this incredible systematic approach. The four establishments of mindfulness, it's a sutra, and there's just like this list of things that you do. And so again, I say that with some caution, because even in the sutras, we would say that they are cyclical. The path to mental health and well-being, even in our contemporary settings, we really need to recognize that there is a cyclical nature. It is nonlinear. But when we talk about by design, I would say if you unpack these teachings, that it is in their design, that there's really this research. If I think as a researcher, study design is to have a really good research question, to come up with a really sound methodology, to follow that out, and then to see what the outcomes are and iterate from that. And I think those practices are incredibly congruent with this body of knowledge. I think it's another reason that it's really accessible and being taken up in so many contemporary research spaces, is because of that initial design that is kind of embedded within it.
I love this. Can I ask something, James, just while we're here? I'd love to hear a little bit more about your relationship with Thich Nhat Hanh, which is pretty exciting to have you on. We've had a couple of people from Plum Village here before, and we always like hearing about people's experience of Thich Nhat Hanh. He's one of my favorites as well. And then also, do you find that sort of being steeped in Thich Nhat Hanh's approach to some of these things has been of service to you as a scientist? And if so, why?
Yeah. Oh, fun questions. I'll
Yeah,
work
good.
my way backwards a little. I will come back to my kind of relationship to Thai as a teacher, but you just really sparked that. I think something really interesting about being trained in his community in the literature. Thai is credited with coining the phrase engaged Buddhism or engaged mindfulness. And he really, his whole career was interested in renewing Buddhism, in going back to its roots, in what he would say, looking at how we bring it into the language of our times. And so this permission from a Zen master to play, to iterate, to update. And if you read, his body of work, he has always been incredibly interested in connecting with scientists and feeling like we were speaking the same language. And so I've had so much support from him and from the community in this work. And I'm, so grateful for that, because it's this deep well of knowledge, and to have had a scholar who went back and kind of triangulated across different, lineages and traditions to kind of look at what is the core of this wisdom and how do we translate it into our times has been, I think, just a great benefit, to us globally, but specifically as scientists. And I've actually worked directly with many of the monastics at his center, Plum Village, France, cultivating science retreats and neuroscience retreats, and actually bringing folks together in those spaces to look at what is our common language, what is our different language, and how do we build bridges to really enhance and inform each other's work. And so I think that is just
Wow.
so much of like the fun of this space.
It's so fun. Can you is there anything like, I don't know, like, so that's a big piece. Is there anything like sharp and surprising that happened in there that you can tell us about? I mean, so you're bringing together this tradition of engaged Buddhism. Neuroscientists are somewhere in this story as well. Was there anything sort of surprising or like specific in there that would be interesting to tell us?
Yeah, it's so fascinating. I think, I don't know if it's surprising, because when you're in the space, and I think, again, like one of the fun things is like the 14 mindfulness trainings are the set of core trainings for his core community that I have received. And the first few are like, openness, non-dogmatism, and like they just overlap onto so much of what we value in research in terms of like.
Oh, I was about to say that's so interesting. Those are the virtues that I'm looking at right now that make good, just cognitive agents, which is being humble about your own predictions, being open-minded and flexible, being willing to update relative to better evidence. So you're saying just so not only are sorry to cut you off short, but like rather than just having neuroscientists look at Buddhist outcomes, you're saying also training in this engaged Buddhism might be a good way to be a good scientist.
Exactly. And so I think,
love that.
not so surprising as someone who grew up in this tradition. Like I grew up in both lenses. I grew up in academics, loving learning. I grew up in Plum Village. So to me, it's always made sense. So it doesn't surprise me. But your question made me remember like what was like delightful or like delicious for both the scientists and the Buddhist, monastics when we were there, was just this incredible congruency and how both sets of knowledge really enhanced one another. And that coming in, folks might think there's going to be tension. They're so different. I mean, yeah, we have like social, cultural contexts that are different. But I think as we're learning across so much of academia right now, when we consider what hasn't been centered in our wisdom, what has been marginalized, what do we want to bring in and inform us, that there's just this like richness and enhancement. And so I think, the fun stories, like we had one scientist who focuses on prediction error, which was fun when you came in and talked to the class about that, because I had spent this time and they're sharing about it. And then the Buddhist monks are contributing like and I should say monks and nuns and everyone in between the spectrum. We're also looking at gender diversity and inclusion there in the Plum Village community, which I also appreciate in terms of openness. But as we were all together in this setting, the scientists presenting on their recent findings in prediction error, having the input from the Buddhist scholars, and it was so congruent. They were all seeing new things in their own training, in their own research. And so I think that was the most, maybe not surprising for me, but like delicious and delightful.
Yeah.
It's just, wow, like this all enhances each other, but also that there's so much congruency already. I think we were discussing when you came to my class the other week, if the equation is, on one side or in there is neuroscience or is like the study of consciousness, if everyone's studying the same phenomenon, like what's on both sides of the equation, whether it's, academic contemporary science or like contemplative Buddhist thought, it should, some summation should go in the same direction.
Yeah, it's just, there's so much to talk about here, and let's keep going down this path. So let's talk about Plum Village itself. Plum Village sounds like, I always think, like one of those cartoon villages, like Plum, it sounds like a pop-up book. What is Plum Village? What's unique about it? And what's your experience been while you were there?
Yes, what a beautiful question. And so Plum Village kind of manifested, so I guess a little bit about Thich Nhat Hanh, for those not familiar, ordained as a Buddhist monk in Vietnam at the age of 16 and went through the war there. Some of us call it the Vietnam War, some the American War, from different social cultural perspectives. But during that war, he had this kind of tension in himself. Did he remain, a monastic in a temple, kind of removed from the world, or go out into the world to help to face the suffering in his country? And so he chose to do both. He went out as an activist and organized hundreds of thousands of youth across the country to do social work, to rebuild villages. He has just incredible stories that in the face of great violence and trauma, drawing upon these teachings, drawing upon these practices, this is where engaged Buddhism comes in, to have like a post-colonial activist, social, political movement, but that is grounded not in like hatred or anger, and he connected with Dr. Martin Luther King, nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize because of their conversations around what does it mean to have activism, to bring science and practice into the world truly from a space of nonviolence, which means hatred for no one, including yourself, both internally and externally. So these are kind of some of the values that Thich had lived by his entire life. He was exiled from Vietnam. He came to the US to speak out against the war, continued to refuse to take any sides, but really call for peace, call for engagement from a place of love and compassion. And this is the work of his lifetime. And so coming back to that question, Plum Village, when he had no home territory, he wound up in France and started this beautiful mindfulness practice center that is now known as Plum Village. And I've been reading stories about the early days that it has the word village in it because his heart was to create a space where people could feel at home, to return to themselves, to connect with each other. And it has grown, in the original stories, they were lighting fires with bits of coal in these old farmhouses. And now it's, an international center. He has centers all around the world that are part of the international Plum Village community. And I've worked and facilitated retreats and supported tours all over the world. But Plum Village remains the kind of home base, if you will, in France, where we've hosted, as I said, retreats for thousands and thousands of people every year come through. So that's a little bit, about the history, I guess, of Plum Village and Thai.
And just to bring this back to the mental health benefits, because it's quite a natural lead-in, let's do it. What are the mental health benefits of mindfulness?
Yeah, nice.
Let's go.
Yeah. Mindfulness has been shown to reduce anxiety and stress and increase sense of personal wellness. It has benefits across memory recall and interoception and immune system function, and the list goes on. And in fact, if listeners are interested, we could draw up a slide of the evidence base in terms of healthcare that is benefiting both patients in terms of their interactions with their diagnosis with pain. It's helping clinicians in terms of their interactions with patients and colleagues, seeing themselves and patients as humans. In educational spaces, we see a similar cascade of benefits. in terms of both the caregiver and those cared for. So if in healthcare, we're looking at clinicians and patients, in education, we're looking at teachers, staff, and students and parents, this constellation of humans that grow and learn together, and how it decreases burnout and anxiety and increases like pro-social behavior in business settings. We're seeing, again, how it impacts the bottom line, what it does to, highly effective teams. And, the list goes on. What I want to say is when I was presenting on this at MIT, that's a long list of benefits to claim the phenomenon that you happen to work in. So what I want to say is why a cascade of benefits.
Nice.
What I would propose is just like, from a physical perspective, we've kind of accepted, like, if I'm fit, there's a cascade of benefits, to my body, to my physique, to all these things. So too, if I'm mentally fit, if I'm dealing with a training that has to do with my cognition, then there's a cascade of cognitive benefits. So if we look at all the things I just listed, right, they have to do with our cognition. They have to do with perhaps how we are narrating the story of our lives. And so a set of trainings that impacts that, again, you're going to get this long laundry list of benefits, just like you do for physical.
Yeah, like if you do anything that improves your emotional resilience, then you're going to get thousands of bang-on effects. Well, you're going to get dozens of bang-on effects anyway, because our emotional resilience, or our ability to emotionally regulate, actually cascades in all sorts of things, like sleep, diet, communication, relationships, everything else. Yeah, great answer.
And what are the drawbacks?
Yeah. None. Mindfulness solves everything. No, scratch that for the record. This is where we want to be very careful. And I say
Indeed.
that for anyone coming in, know that was me. It's so funny actually. In healthcare spaces, there is nothing that we make a 100% claim on. We are careful and aware of that. That is part of our culture and as researchers. And yet there's this interesting thing, with media coverage, or even in healthcare and educational spaces, where there's this like assumption, or sometimes folks hear this claim, like this solves everything. And of course, we want to be careful of that, mindful of that, and to say, any given intervention, we know that there can be risks associated. And also what from the benefits, how do we mitigate those risks? How do we hold them? How do we discuss them? So just, I would say in any tradition of science, in all of our traditions of interventions in healthcare, that we know there can be incredible benefits, and that is exciting and, motivates us to bring this forward. And we know also that there are, risks associated, and that, there is no one modality, there is no one catch-all for mental health, particularly when we're talking about research around like human behavior and our own cognition, to be like so respectful and validating around the spectrum of experience that can happen. What it means to bring it in. And like, Mark was in my class presenting on this, and maybe I'll invite you to jump in on just like how we hold this. And there's so many, critiques in the literature. And I love that, because this is a collaboration. It's a conversation that we want to be aware of. So I have more to say on that, but Mark, please jump in and join me on this.
No, that's great. And for anybody listening, Elli's referring to, she invited me in to guest lecture at one of her courses last week, or a couple of weeks ago, which was fantastically exciting. Her students are amazing. And we got to chat a little bit about the benefits and detriments of meditation. The one thing I'd add is even meditation itself is a really complicated phenomenon. It's not clear cut exactly what you're doing. So being present, maybe that is good for everybody at all times, to be a little bit more present with what's going on. That could probably be the case, but that's not the extent. That's not usually what we mean by meditation as a complete package. And it can mean a lot of different things. So of course, like navigating the complexity of a practice in the face of having a complex mind that can move in good ways or less good ways. I mean, it's a really complicated subject. What I really appreciate about your research and about your approach is this care and consideration when you're discussing it. I think it's needed. I think it's really important that we, like you say, everywhere else we're careful when we say like this intervention, now look, there's going to be good and bad, and it's going to have to do with a lot of context. Context is king. I think that's actually the best view to take if you're going to start practicing, if you want positive outcomes, is that context is king.
Absolutely. Yeah. And just to jump in, you were kind of inspiring me as well to plant also that we have, I think in our current context, a potentially limited conceptualization of mindfulness.
Right. Tell us about that. We love this. We love this on this show. Say more. Say more about that.
Yes, and I'm so passionate about like broadening the conceptualization of mindfulness.
Exactly.
We have a lot of respect and also understanding for some of the reasons why we have this more limited perspective. While mindfulness is perhaps this long-term phenomenon, both in a Buddhist lens, a few thousand years of research and discussion, in terms of iterating it into our contemporary spaces, that's a recent thing. And so there is some tension there, some excitement there, a lot of wisdom to draw on, but also like a new thing that we're conceptualizing as a culture.
Definitely.
And I also want to hold that, mindfulness, contemplative practice, reflective practices are not owned by any one culture or tradition. They have roots in so many practices around the world. So to hold that broader idea and then to come back to the lenses I bring, which is like engaged mindfulness, this like tradition of Thich Nhat Hanh and Plum Village, which is calling upon us to bring this into daily life. That yes, one form of mindfulness, sometimes I think of it like the method, like meditation maybe is a method and we have different types of methods, but like let's broaden out to like what is our like methodology and our like paradigm, and like we can broaden this. And we would say in qualitative research, we don't want to be missing cases from our study. And so maybe some of the methods that we've honed or publicized more in our contemporary settings, if we're looking at mindfulness-based interventions, they're beautiful. They're the set of interventions that are designed for specific populations, patients with chronic pain, patients, with relapse and depression. But what you're designing for those populations is going to be really particular. What you're designing when you're bringing this through apps is going to be really particular. And so I'm not critiquing. I am a fan and proponent of all of these methods and modalities. And I'm asking, what else are we bringing in? As we move deeper into having the evidence base to support different types of programming, just again, like in research and healthcare, we're interested in like, who's the population? What is of most service? And so the tradition I come from, being engaged mindfulness, we would say, get it off the cushion. How are you applying this to your walking, to your eating, to your speaking? What does it mean just to live as a mindful person? I'm talking to some researchers who are like looking into this. And so I'm so interested in broadening the conceptualization, not necessarily to say we need to change or modify what's in these programs, but just what is the collection of modalities we have?
What else is there?
Right? What else is there? And like what, I've been involved in like flash mob meditations with the Plum Village monastics. We were like in New York City and we sent out, some stuff across social media to like meet us in Union Square for like a sitting meditation at like 4 p.m. on this day. And we showed up. The square's full of people. It's loud. It's chaotic. We have no idea what's about to happen. There's people shouting. There's people rapping. There's like just like all this stuff happening. And 20 of us who are on this teaching tour with Tai, we sit down and like 200 people just sat down and became silent. They had all been waiting. We had no idea. And the silence was like deafening. It was so powerful to sit in the city. And as you were sitting there, someone came by and started yelling, "What are you doing? What are you doing? What are you protesting?" And some of the young folks have been like rapping, like, can't you see? Like they're sitting, they're just being peaceful. And there was like this whole like, argument happening near us. And we just sat there. And it was such a powerful way to build community, to come together and just like to touch some like stillness and peace in the city. So it's just like an example of there's a lot of ways to do this. It's no one thing.
It's cool.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating image. Like, I can't really picture it.
I can. You can't? Come on. Have you seen a flash mob before?
No.
You've got to look it up. It's amazing. People walk in, but usually it goes the other way. People are calmly doing their thing and suddenly they break into dance. This is just the anti-flash mob, which is everybody's dancing and then suddenly they just stop and they're cool. I love that. Wow.
You've been working in healthcare spaces. What's that been like with mindfulness?
Yeah, and like, can we give Jamie a shout out for helping us stay on track? Because Mark and I, like, we have way too much fun with this, and we will just run around the world. And so I just want to bring some metacognition. Right, we're self-aware. We have to practice. So as I say this, give me my props again.
What was it like bringing mindfulness into a healthcare?
Yeah, and this is wonderful. And I think this is what's really fun though, is like as researchers that we're playing and we're doing flash mobs and we're like seeing the impact of that on ourselves. And then we're thinking like, how do we bring this into a specific context or space? And so as a researcher, I'm really interested in what we say in the literature as a settings approach. So how are we really meeting the setting, the population, what are the schedules there, and how does mindfulness truly integrate with that? I want to say, when I think about bringing it into healthcare, we really want to recognize, and I've worked both bringing it into healthcare for the clinicians, for the leadership teams, and for the patients. And for all of these groups, I'm really interested in the barriers that can exist in healthcare spaces, and they can be similar in education and even in corporate and business. I mean, the first is time. We don't have time for this. And the second is putting the burden of wellness or mental health on the individual versus the system. And I think these are really, really rich and interesting questions.
Yeah.
And something, and also like this eye roll I get sometimes when clinicians are like, we're going to do a mindfulness workshop. They're like, great, I'm really busy. And so also just to be careful that, for me, I want mindfulness, and this is data from physician participants I had in the study, to become a way of life, that it is integrated, it meets you where you are, it isn't an extra thing you have to do. It's not just the pizza party that we're checking off to say, oh, we helped make you well with this 1 hour introduction session. Not to knock 1 hour of wellness sessions, because we need those as well. But that as a researcher, I'm really interested, particularly in healthcare settings, and as we see, increased levels of attrition and burnout in healthcare and education, going through what we've just gone through as a global society with the pandemic, but also before that, what we see in terms of the burden of health, who the physician is or who a teacher is, matters so much. In fact, can I have both of you do a little experiment with me for everyone that I sometimes do in classes when we talk about bringing this into healthcare? Okay.
Yeah, let's do it.
You can close your eyes or keep them open, but just call to mind a teacher who you loved from your childhood or university. Just call one teacher to mind. Think about, how do you think they popped into your mind? If you're listeners, you can do this as well. Just remembering a teacher who you really, really liked. And then just seeing whoever pops to mind. And can both of you just tell me about this person? Tell me anything that comes to mind.
It's John Vervaeke. He's energetic and enthusiastic and wise and engaged and loving, and really gives a shit about his students. I mean, really, honestly cares about his students and cares about the work. Yeah.
And mine was a special education teacher I worked with when I was a little bit younger, who was very patient with me.
Yeah. And so this interesting thing, both of you just told me these qualities of who they are. I've asked this question to hundreds of people around the world in different social, cultural contexts. And I have yet to hear, I love my grade 4 teacher because they taught me multiplication. I have heard they were patient, they were fun, they were kind, they took time for me. All these skill sets that are what we would say are part of the hidden curriculum, right? It's the embodiment of who this person is. And the same thing for healthcare workers, right? When you ask, have you ever had someone really take care of you in a mental health space? Or I'm bringing mindfulness into the physical therapy curriculum at U of T, and we ask the students there, did you have a PT you loved before you decided to become a PT? And, they named, again, they didn't say I love my PT because they gave me this great, stretch for my shoulder. They were they explained things well. They were excited to work with me. And so, I bring all this up because you say, how are we bringing this into these settings? What does it mean to practice mindfulness? And this interesting thing also, when we talk about the evidence base, helping folks get on board to say the wellness, right, of the clinician, of the teacher, of the parent, of each of us as humans, that is what matters for us to do our best work, as scientists. All of these things, I would say, we're trading on the commodity of our intellect, right? Our knowledge production as scientists, as clinicians, that's what we're utilizing. And so just as scientists, we keep our tools in excellent condition that we're going to use for an experiment. And so if the tool you're using for the job you do is your own mind, then mental health really matters. And
of course you want your doctor to be wise and engaged and careful. I mean, of course that should be the training, in addition to learning about bones and surgery and blood types. You want them to be compassionate but balanced, accurate, engaged but not burned out from their engagement. I mean, that's what you need. So of course, maybe that's a no-brainer. There has to be a training for that. Whatever you call that training, there has to be a training for that.
Exactly. And it kind of brings us back to where Jamie started us, why Buddhist psychology, or why this set of trainings? Why are we talking about Buddhist thought, or why are we talking about mindfulness in the context of mental health? And I bring us back to what I brought up at the beginning. Like, you want if you're a surgeon and you want best practices, you want to go to the folks who have been looking into that particular surgery to find out their best practices. And so just the same for me as a scientist, the folks who have been looking at, mental health, well-being, how do we cultivate wellness in ourselves and transform our suffering? I want to find out what is this body of knowledge they've developed. And then I'm so interested and delighted by this moment in time where I can bring my knowledge production as a scientist, as a researcher, and build these bridges to kind of bring this into our contemporary settings of healthcare, of education, and beyond. So that is what gets me out of bed and excited.
I think that's a lovely way of putting it. You spoke about the courses, quote, or rather you wrote about the courses, quote, developing students' skills in metacognitive and phenomenological reflection. What does that mean?
Yeah, so fun. Well, and it's interesting. So the courses I'm teaching, so I'm currently in the Buddhism Psychology Mental Health program at the University of Toronto. And the students in this program are within the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. So we have this really interesting collection of students, and you kind of upper your courses. Maybe we have a lot of folks in like psychology or cognitive science, but then in my larger classes, and just to say, I will come back to what that means, is we're interested in like exploring the idea of consciousness through our own reflection, and our kind of what we would say like our N of one. And so bringing in, and also, I was gonna say in the bigger classes, we have this just students from like global health and biochem and mathematics and basic science to students in like equity studies. And so all these different minds that are curious and coming to a program that's talking about Buddhism, psychology, and mental health. And so how do you produce knowledge with all of these different interests and backgrounds, and bringing together these wisdom streams of both like science and Dharma, what we would say are the Buddhist kind of collection of teachings. And so when you're like, what does that mean? What it means is some of the language I'm trying to use to describe the type of learning modalities that we're bringing into these courses. And I would say, for me also, this comes back to like, how does this impact mental health? And I think, human behavior is so complex, and each one of us on any given day is going to be bringing different things to the table. And so having different ways of producing knowledge, both didactic lecture, but also hands-on reflective practices, and then, writing papers and doing scientific research that's informed both by more traditional, academic annotated bibliographies and reading peer-reviewed journals, but also by data that we're collecting on ourselves. And I would say, for me, a meditation practice is always an opportunity to collect some data. So I hope that kind of answered your question about those words that I had collected there.
What do you mean by meditation as an opportunity to collect some data?
Yeah, so for me, and as I say, I like to think of the Buddha as like a researcher, right? And there's some like research question around like, what is suffering and how does it transform? And then if we're transforming it, what is maybe wellness? What is that pathway? And so for me, when I think about, and for listeners, those who have maybe a longer term practice, or if you've never tried a meditative practice, I like to think of a meditation like a bit of an experiment. So, on any given day, and again, as Mark pointed out, what do I mean by meditation? A whole other collection of things in particular literature, because we say like, we did a 5-minute meditation, and what does that mean? So I can go into what I mean by that, but collecting data, just to stop in your day to observe your mind and whatever approach you perhaps have to that through your meditation, whether it's sitting still with your eyes closed and anchoring in your breath, more of a focused attention practice, an open awareness practice, which might be, starting with some focused attention and then opening up to observe what is there, a metta or compassion practice, or maybe, you're an engaged practitioner and you're applying some of these anchoring techniques while you walk down the street. I like to do it while I send emails and brush my teeth. So lots of options. But in all these options, I think there's this opportunity to collect data, which is to become aware of my internal states, to have maybe some awareness of what is happening physically in my body, in my mind, in kind of the objects of my mind, what I'm, ruminating on in that day, the quality of my mind, and then to anchor that back in my body. For those of you who are scholars, I just went through the 4 parts of the 4 establishments of mindfulness just for fun as an Easter egg. You can go back to it. But just saying like, this is the day, those are the 4 systematic steps that the Buddha laid out for us to establish mindfulness. And so if we do that, any of these practices, just even focusing our attention on our breath, if we're a beginner, in that moment, I think a lot of folks think I have to do it right. I'm supposed to feel calm all of a sudden, or, my nervous system is supposed to whatever. And this is some, a pressure we can put on ourselves. And so when we frame a meditation as an opportunity to collect data, as an experiment, we can relieve ourselves of some of the burden of getting it right, of it having a specific and immediate outcome. Because we know as scientists, we're just collecting data. It's going to inform us. Like in an experiment, if I pour in the chemicals and I get the solution I wanted, fantastic. If it explodes, fantastic. I just have data to proceed with my experiment. And I think mental health framed like this is so beautiful, which is I am a living experiment. I'm an N of one. And so I don't have to get a specific outcome, but I can get more data on myself in my day. I can know today I was not able to focus at all during a focused meditation practice. And I can just be kind to that. I can say hey, that maybe means I have something on my mind that's pulling my attention. What is that? It might mean that when I speak to my family over dinner tonight, I'm going to be more irritable and listen less. And that's great data for me to have.
Yeah, that's awesome. And instead of trying to think of that you're trying to shoehorn yourself into some state, lo and behold, it's by getting more data that those positive states come about. They're almost side effects rather than primary aims, because the more we learn about ourselves, the more the system updates by itself. I love this. Very, very apt.
Yeah, there's also this like meta thing going on with data. So you have the metadata of I might be irritable later, but then there's the data you're getting about what it is to be a human and have a human experience. So you have the macro, this is what it is to exist, and then the micro, well, this particular feature of my current psychology might lead to action X, Y, or Z.
Yeah, and so I think that is such a gift to ourselves and the people around us to be continuously collecting the data, Mark's language of updating the system based on the data, that's the best I can do. And so I think that's a really interesting part of this collection of what I would say is this thought technology that we have coming from these trainings is, how do I collect data on myself? How do I hold that data? What do I do with it going forward? And all of that is kind of integrated into this body of knowledge.
No wonder you have to be a scientist to do this well, because those are all that's all philosophy of science, isn't it? What do you do with data? How do you update relative to your new data?
And this is why we have so much fun with the scientists when we're in Plum Village, because this language is just so fun to kind of dance with back and forth.
Yeah.
Before we finish up, I saw that you spoke in Bhutan, and I was wondering whether that's quite a different talk there, or whether it's received differently because they're Buddhist as a country.
Yeah, it was a wonderful experience. I was invited there in partnership with the Gross National Happiness Center, and I went with a touring team of monastics from Plum Village and lay folks to teach. And, a great question, which is you're in this totally different social cultural context. And so there was parts of it that were different, parts that were totally similar, but I'll say what was one of the really interesting things is being in a space where this language of compassion and love is so valued. We met with some politicians there and had this funny thing, because just like in any country, politicians want to sell you on the things they think that you'll value. And in this cultural context, it was using words like love and compassion. But also with the high school students, it was interesting because something I really took in, we were working with high school students there. This was part of my work actually that I did for my master's, looking at bringing mindfulness into education. And working with high school students in Bhutan and working with high school students in New York City, all of them really collectively as humans are experiencing the same things: bullying, talking behind each other's backs, being self-conscious. And so this body of teachings really resonated with all the groups. It really opened up safe spaces for sharing and saying mindfulness maybe is beyond meditation, that it was about skillful communication. What was very culturally different though was I was working with some groups where in Bhutan, getting to high school students being I love my friends, or being one of the monks one morning asked the high school students who woke up and said they loved the mountains this morning, and all the high school students were yeah, of course we did that. So that was a little culturally different. So getting to those places where the language that was accessible was different. But what was at the heart of the practice, and I think also maybe as we're concluding here, why mental health, why this body of teachings, that we're really interested in what it means to be human. And so not to invalidate that as each human, we have different histories, cultural contexts. We want to be very mindful and aware in our Buddhist language of the historical realm of reality, to totally validate our different lived experiences, and to recognize our like collective experience of being human and what it means to tap into being loved, being seen, collecting data on ourselves. And so for me, that was like incredibly congruent. And a really cool thing about being in Bhutan was like, cool, like high school students everywhere are like gossiping behind each other's backs and making each other feel bad. Like we can just get right into this together.
Elli, last question of the day is: what is the single biggest practical takeaway that listeners, perhaps those without a strong meditation practice, should take away from your research and your experience?
Nice.
Ooh. All right. Off the top of my head, I would just say, from working with so many folks of different ages and different contexts and researching this particularly with clinicians, that the kind of key finding is that mindfulness can become a way of life, that it isn't a burden, another to-do list, something that is going to drag you down that you have to do in this one way for 20 minutes a day and just hope it lasts. That I really just want to invite you to play with it, to investigate it, to bring in that scientific mind of curiosity. And that's my biggest takeaway is I really think, as we said, we want to hold, there are of course limitations and further research needed, but at its heart that we have this body of teachings and knowledge and wisdom that's been passed down to us that is open access. Make it your own, just like physical fitness, right? It becomes a way of life when we find like the exercises that bring us joy and work in our daily life. So enjoy, play, explore, join the family, check out the evidence if you're evidence-based, and just, see what meets you where you are.
That was Elli Weisbaum, and that was the Contemplative Science Podcast. Thank you so much for listening, as always. It's such a pleasure to be able to bring you this show, and we hope you enjoy listening to it half as much as we enjoy recording it. And as always, we will be back next week.